Well, welcome to today's webinar, How to Design and Easily Automate Fraud Fighting Analytics. My name is Jim Kaplan. I'm president and founder of AuditNet, the global resource for auditors. The webinar today is being brought to you by Arbutus and BKD. Today's presenters are Dustin Lewis and Jeremy Clopton. Before I turn the floor over to our speakers to introduce the agenda, I'd like to briefly cover the housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording after the webinar is over. It takes us about an hour or two to get that link up, but you will be receiving that. There's also a disclaimer, and that reflects the views expressed by the presenters do not necessarily represent the views, positions, of AuditNet or the presenter's respective organization. You will receive a link to the recording, as I said. You are able to submit questions via the chat box on your screen. Just submit your questions and either Jeremy, Dustin, or myself will answer them. Please be patient as we try to answer all the questions that we can. We will also be launching polling questions during the webinar. We are required to do this to qualify you for NASBA CPE. You must answer all 3 polling questions that are launched in order to receive CPE. Also, at the end of the webinar, we will be sending out an evaluation. Please complete the webinar evaluation to help us improve future webinars. At this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dustin and Jeremy, who will introduce themselves and continue with today's program. Dustin?
Thank you, Jim. I'll leave your disclaimer up here for a moment. Sorry I didn't flip to that one. This is Dustin Lewis from Arbutus software. Jeremy and our contact information will be at the end of the slide deck, so if you want to contact us. My background is I spent a lot of time as a user and an ACL employee doing a lot of continuous monitoring and building applications and solutions and doing some training. Spent some time at PricewaterhouseCoopers doing analytics there and continuing on with that here at Arbutus and trying to drive some solutions that I think are beneficial, especially to the internal audit groups. And now we'll have Jeremy introduce himself. Over to you.
All right, thanks, Dustin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Clopton. I'm a director at BKD, and I lead our big data and analytics practice. And my background is actually been with BKD my entire career, and my background is in forensics mainly, fraud investigations and prevention. In addition to leading the big data and analytics practice here at BKD, I also do some serve as an instructor and teach some courses for the ACFE as it relates to analytics for the use of fraud detection. So with that, I'm glad that everybody is here. And before we get too far into the material, I'm going to go ahead and ask Dustin and Jim to go ahead and pull up our first polling question. This will be one of the 3 that's required for CPE. And just to get a feel for who all is on the line, we're curious as to whether or not your organization uses analytics to address fraud, waste, and abuse. Your answer options here are yes, no, or unsure. And we'll give you just a few seconds here to go ahead and make sure that you get the polling question answered. Obviously, we want everybody to get CPE credit, but more importantly, we'd also like to just learn a little bit more about who we're talking with today. You know, as we go throughout the presentation, I think even those of you that are already using analytics in your organization are going to find a lot of valuable information to help you expand the use of analytics and move more into a continuous analytics type of approach, which really helps us to become much more proactive as opposed to a reactive approach when it comes to fraud, waste, and abuse. With that, we'll just a few more seconds here to let everybody answer the poll, and we'll see who all we have with us here today.
Okay, we'll be closing the poll in about another 10 seconds, so if you haven't already answered the polling question, please go ahead and do so. We've got about 95% that have voted, so we will close the polling question now and share the results. Can you see that, Jeremy? Okay.
I can, thank you. It looks like we've got over half the audience is already using analytics for addressing fraud, waste, and abuse. About a third that are not, and a few that are unsure. You know, this is really encouraging. I don't know about you, Dustin, but I think this is really encouraging because that's a number that I think has grown quite a bit over the last few years. I think the ease of use of technology has really helped with that, and hopefully we can show some more of that as we go throughout the webinar today.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an appetite for more. That's awesome.
Definitely. All right, so a quick overview of today's agenda. What we're going to be doing is we already went through our introduction, so from here we're going to jump into an analytics framework, learn a little bit more as to what we can do as we go through each of the processes after that, so what framework do we want to have in mind as we're thinking through accounts payable, payroll, and procurement cards. At that point, we'll then go through those three areas, which will be a little bit of talking about some of the risks and some cases that we've seen there, as well as some demonstrations of the technology as well, and wrap up the webinar today with some closing thoughts and answering any questions that may come in through the chat, the questions feature in the GoToWebinar toolbar. So we'll go ahead, and Dustin, if you'll go ahead and skip through the introduction section. I think we've already kind of handled that as we went through the disclaimer side, and we will go ahead and jump right into the analytics framework. You know, as it relates to setting up analytics in an organization, no matter where or how you're trying to apply it, I think it's useful to have a framework, especially for everybody that's on the line that maybe is an internal audit or accounting. I know I'm a CPA is my background. Frameworks and structure, they're a good thing. We tend to like those. So we'll jump right into the framework here. And as we do that, there are going to be 6 steps that we're going to go through there. You can see them here: getting a strategic question out there, defining objectives, getting data, developing procedures, and then using the results. We'll go ahead and go through our second polling question. Jim, if you'll pull that up here. You know, as we think through this process, what we want to do is we want to figure out, for you all that are on the line, what is your biggest challenge as it relates to using analytics? I mean, we had about 56% of the group that was already using analytics, but even for you all that are using analytics, and for those of you that aren't, what are your biggest challenges? Is it data access? Is it data quality? Software limitations? Other challenges? Maybe it's you know, skill set of personnel, getting the right people on the right seat on the bus, so to speak, or unsure. You know, there might be a whole host of other challenges as well that you're facing, but want to try to get categorically what those are. So we'll give everybody just a few minutes here, and I see Jim sent out a quick reminder, but for those of you that are just joining, the slides are available in the handout section of the control panel. You'll also be able to ask your questions there. We've got our second polling question up now, so for those of you that are looking for CPE, please go ahead and answer that, and then we're actually going to go through the bulk of the webinar before we get to our third polling question, so hopefully we can have a little bit of a bit more of a flow without interruption there. So Jim, how's the polling question looking?
We've got about 95% that have voted, so we'll leave it open for another 10 seconds. Go ahead and answer the polling question, and then we'll close the poll, share the results, and we'll turn it back to Jeremy and Dustin. Okay, we'll go ahead and close the poll now. Share the results.
All right, thank you, Jim. Looks like it's a pretty even split here. Data access is one. I know that's something that I hear about quite a bit with some of the organizations that I work with, as well as data quality. The good news on data quality, that's something that hopefully you can have some influence and control over. Software limitations, other and unsure, all pretty well split across the board there. Unsure, I'm guessing it's probably a variety of different challenges, and sometimes not knowing where to start can be a challenge as well. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right back into the material.
Yeah. I think my screen can come back. There we are.
All right, so back to our framework for applying analytics. Again, there are 6 phases to applying analytics, as you can see on the arrow here, and we're going to jump right into the this next slide will help focus us through there. We're going to walk through each of these. So the first one that we want to focus on is a strategic question. Now, as we go through as we go through each of these, payables, payroll, and analytics, what we want to think of is for that specific area, what's our strategic question that we're really trying to answer? Are we trying to answer the question where in our organization do we have conflicts of interest or kickback risks? Where's the corruption risk? What are our specific questions that we're wanting to answer? From there, we'll move on to the second phase, which is defining our objectives. And once we have those objectives, what we're really trying to do with them is what are the different objectives we need to meet to be able to answer our strategic question. And again, depending on how specific the question is, will help us define what our specific objectives are. From there, we can move on to everybody's favorite thing, which is obtaining data. And yes, that means we're going to have to work with the IT departments. I know data access was right up there with about a quarter of the audience there mentioning that as your challenge. Getting data is something that we really need to put probably more time into than we initially think about. We want to make sure that we obtain the data, and there are two different types of data to obtain. First, the data that we want to be analyzing, and second, the data that we need for follow-up. What we don't want to do is get a bunch of results that are spectacular and then realize we don't have what we need to do proper follow-up on those results. So we want to make sure that we're working with the IT department earlier rather than later, and go ahead and get as much data as possible up front. The next phase in this process is developing the procedures, and this is something that I know that can be daunting a little bit for quite a few folks, so we're going to take it even further on this one, and we're going to dive in specifically to the development of the procedures. And there's really a process that we want to walk through for that. So the very first thing that we want to do in the procedure development phase is we want to develop ad hoc individual procedures. And Dustin, if you'll go ahead to that next arrow there, we can see that what we're going to do is we're going to figure out how do we get that first procedure. We're not going to try to automate it right out of the gate. We're going to make sure that we have a procedure that works and we know what we're getting. And then from there, as you can see, we're going to go ahead and we're going to automate that individual test. And once we have automated that individual procedure, we can do another procedure and another procedure. And once we get there, we get to automated groups. So instead of having to run each individual procedure, running each of them individually and then running each of them automated, now we can just automate a group that says maybe here's our vendor risk tests, and we're going to automate that group. And then finally, once we get there, we can get to more of a scheduled type of analytic, which is the continuous analytics or continuous auditing or monitoring, depending on the application. I know, Dustin, continuous analytics is something that you're very passionate about.
Yeah, and going to talk a lot of my little bits of demonstration that are going to be focused towards that and some ways to make that, well, we had 72% was connected to technology, and data were the biggest challenges in the last poll, and I'm going to hone in on that and ways to make that far less painless so the continuous can be something you can actually do.
Very nice. All right, so once we've developed our procedures, now we're on to the stuff that we're all familiar with. First step then after that is going to be analyzing the results. So what do the results even tell us? Even if you've never run an analytic before, you know how to analyze results. If you've done sampling, if you've done transaction testing of any type, you've done this before. Now you're just doing it with technology. You want to make sure that if you have false positives that you go back in and update your procedures as necessary to get better results. And then once you have quality results that you know you can use, now you have to manage them. And you have to figure out what exactly am I going to do with each of these results. How are we going to push those out to the business process owners, or where do these specific results need to go so that we can best manage them and so that we can best manage our fraud risk and be as proactive as possible. And once we do that, you'll notice that we've hit the end of the arrow, but really it's all cyclical. Once we manage those results, we need to go back to the start, ask a new strategic question, define new objectives, obtain more data, develop procedures, and analyze, and keep going through there. So, as we get into the specific areas, we'll get into some specific measures or benchmarks that we might want to be monitoring, that we can make this as successful as possible. And depending on whether or not you're at the management level or maybe an internal audit level where you're doing the transaction testing, those specific measures and benchmarks may vary. But we'll get into some of those as we go. And with that, let's jump right in to our next section, which is accounts payable. And accounts payable, if you're looking for a great place to start analytics, this is it, because accounts payable is one of the areas that has some of the most common fraud risks out there. If you look at the common issues that exist in accounts payable, typically we can see that they fall into four main categories: corruption, fictitious vendors, fictitious invoices, and check theft. And Dustin, if you'll jump ahead to that next slide there, we can see that these four issues really are at the heart of most of the fraud. If we look at the ACFE's report to the nations, corruption is one of the most common fraud schemes across the board, across all industries. Sadly, in the update this year in 2016, it was even the most common fraud scheme for religious organizations. And to me, that was just, I was sad to see that, because typically that's not the case. Corruption wasn't #1 for churches, but now it was this year. So that was a bit, that was a bit tough to see. But corruption is something that we don't see in our audit, in our audit plan. We don't see it in the APG. There's not a work program for it. So what does corruption look like? Well, this is an example here, and if you're all looking at the slides, you can see that we have a red line that at some point intersects a vertical black line, and what that is, the black line is the termination date for a purchasing director, and the red line, those are the activity patterns of vendors that were taking him on vacations and providing him trips and other kickbacks. That person wasn't actually, that person wasn't actually fired for this. They were terminated for other reasons, and then it turned out after the fact that they weren't getting the responses to their RFPs. So you start to look at this and you say, okay, well, how do we find that with analytics? One of the things that you can look for here, and a question came in related to measures and benchmarks for successful analytics. One thing that you might want to be measuring here is, every time that we have a purchase contract, an RFP or an RFQ, do we have a concentration of this vendor is always used when this employee is in charge of that process? Maybe you're cycling your purchasing managers through, but every time that somebody's involved, a particular vendor is used. Looking for that clustering of those concentrations can be very important.
Yeah, Jeremy, that reminds me of an example where we were doing some work, an employee-vendor match, and on the surface it looked okay by address and things like that, but then we added in the actual 4 owners of each business, up to 4, and then we started getting name matches where somebody who worked for the organization was also part owner in a contracting firm that happened to get a lot of bids awarded to them.
Yeah, and using the employee and vendor files is such a great way to tackle some of this corruption risk. Doing that join between the files is something that most data analytics software really excels at. I know Arbutus does quite beautifully. And if we look at this next example, it's precisely that. It's looking at vendor-employee matches, and you can see here we have employees that match a vendor. In fact, if you look at the second line there, George Davis actually matches on tax ID number as well. And what's interesting is that the total payments is pretty small by most accounts for most organizations. The problem is this is an organization where there's a state ethics statute that said they can't do that. They can't actually do business with an employee-owned vendor. So while it wasn't necessarily fraud, it did turn out to be something that was an ethics code violation for their organization. It's a very simple test looking at address, tax ID number, etc. In this next example, go ahead, sorry.
The reputation risk sometimes too is even more than the dollar amount.
Yeah, it really is. And as it relates to reputation, this is something that really hurt the reputation of this organization. This is the city of Dixon, Illinois, and that's one that if you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage you to look at some of the court documents. You can see fictitious invoice here. We always encourage folks to look at items that are in round thousand amounts, and this is exactly why. This was a $54 million embezzlement over a period of about 20 years, and you can see over on the right-hand side that they say that this individual created 159 fictitious invoices over a 12-year period, and this one's for $350,000. Such a simple thing to do, and it's such a simple metric to run from an analytics standpoint to catch a very large fraud scheme. A final example I've got here relates to check theft, and this is one where we had an organization that over 3 years an individual took $1.2 million. And what amazed me about this is it was so simple. The red flags to look for were something that are so simple to do with any basic software, and that was looking for checks, again, in those round thousand amounts, but also on weekends or holidays. Almost every check that was in a round thousand amount in this scheme was fraudulent, and then every single one of the of the weekend and holiday checks was part of a fraud scheme here. And in this case, this individual actually went to prison over it. While it doesn't happen in every case, we do see, that from time to time, where if it's big enough, you've got a police department that's willing to take it on. Law enforcement, in this case, prosecuted this individual, and they did go to prison. I think last I saw, most organizations aren't going to recover much from stuff like this, which is why it's so important that we're out there, out there trying to be proactive and using tools like Arbutus to do that and others. All the data analytics tools out there, even Microsoft Excel can do, a weekend or a holiday search. I think last I saw it was about 50% of organizations recover nothing. Now, luckily, this organization, they recovered $1 million of their $1.2 million because they had a great insurance policy and caught it fairly quickly. But it's something that is the exception rather than the norm. So Dustin, here are some basic examples of some of the various fraud schemes that are out there in accounts payable and vendors. Would you care to walk us through how technology can help us find that in a pretty seamless fashion?
Absolutely. Great lead in there, Jeremy, and great examples. Jeremy, he knows all of basically the name brand leading tools. A great guy to talk with, not just about fraud theory, but also how to approach and how to attack it. So I'm going to do today 3 little short, you can call them demonstrations, where I'll show you a little bit of a component of what it would look like a day in the life with Arbutus, with a point towards reading data, not so much razzle-dazzle with analytics, but say, okay, we've got our analytic now, I want to automate this, or I want to share it with somebody in a way that makes sense and is not too onerous. My opinion is, over the years, when it comes to things like continuous monitoring, the technology has not kept up with the needs of the users, and I'm going to highlight some of that as well. Specifically, I'm thinking of things like how a tool acquires data. I really like the way Arbutus grabs data, and I'm going to show you that in a few moments. But this is it's a screen capture from an actual continuous monitoring kind of setup with another tool. And what happens, all those things you see down at the bottom, all those little canisters, those are all data sources, every single one of them. And typically the tools cannot get that data on their own. In other words, it's technically possible to download these maybe with an ODBC driver or something like that, but the downloads themselves can take hours, if not days. As a consultant, I remember several times where you start downloading something on Friday afternoon, you come in Monday morning, and it's still going, and you don't know if it's ever going to finish. So what happens is all of these data sources at the very bottom, a little pyramid all the way across, they all have to be individually handled, and every single one of them you have to figure out, okay, how are we going to move this data to somewhere where our tool can touch it? We're going to make it maybe into a text file, and who's going to do that? So, each one of those databases is probably somebody different, the database owner, and every detail then has to be spec'd out so that the system is expecting this highly specific file structure, and the file has to be the same name, saved to the same place. Everything has to be the same. If anything changes, like let's say instead of calling the file payroll space data, it's called payroll underscore data. That can derail the whole process, and that was something I saw throughout years of sometimes putting together consulting, putting together a monitoring thing, and trying to automate it. The data and the technicality behind it is prohibitive, put it that way. I'm going to flip over now to the actual software, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples with AP here. First thing I'll do is I'm going to just show you what a blank project looks like in Arbutus. If you've used other tools, this may already look familiar to you, but the person that founded Arbutus and developed is the same, was the chief architect of ACL way back in the day. So a lot of that framework and foundation you'll see throughout Arbutus, but there's been a lot of things added towards automation and simplifying the interface and the mechanics that I really appreciate. So this is a blank project, meaning I've got nothing here. However, there's these 3 folders on the left. These are all called shared folders. And shared folders is a big thing with our software in that you can, in real time, share files, scripts, results, etc. with anybody else. not just somebody on the same floor, but it can be across geography as well. And it's very easy to do. You drag and drop. If I want to move something into these folders, and I'll show you that a little bit later, you just move it. And in the back end, all of the work that's done to locate that file and put it somewhere is done automatically, so that if I'm in here and I'm looking at, for example, this OFAC list, this is a vendor match for that, I'm looking at the same file that Jeremy's looking at. We're not copying the data across the board, and we're all working with our individual versions. This just happens, and he's in St. Louis, I'm in Vancouver. That's also not a hindrance. We can both look at the same data, whether I'm at a hotel, the office, whatever. And then I'm going to show you real quick an example of accessing the data. I was talking a little bit how it can be painful to try to acquire data because it takes so long. You end up asking for extractions. Arbutus can go directly to the data. You can use SQL select statements without any modifying. But the other thing I really like is whether it's local or server, if I want to go to an Excel spreadsheet or a database or the limited file, any of those, I'm going to log in here to a database. And when I connect to one or more tables, and just for fun here, I'll connect to a handful. I'm not actually downloading anything. I am just connecting to those tables. So when I'm done with this, you're going to see a handful of connections over here. And these are all ready to go. So there's no download, and I've brought in maybe a huge chunk of a database that I want to work with. I really like that. And then the workflow itself. So what we're going to do going forward here, as Jeremy is going to come back here in a moment and talk through some more scenarios, show how we can take what we have here and turn it into something more repeatable down the road. So Jeremy, I'm going to turn it back to you, and we'll pick up on this when you've covered our next section.
All right, thanks, Dustin. One of the areas, for repeatability, we've already talked about accounts payable. One of the questions that I get quite a bit is, what does continuous mean? Does that mean real time or not? In accounts payable, I think it's at the speed of the business process. That may be something that's monthly, it may be weekly, it may be quarterly. It really depends. When it comes to payroll, though, I think it's much more frequent. And payroll is an area that has quite a few risks within it. And, some of the most common issues that we see there, you'll see, listed here on the screen. And, ghost employees is one that's pretty tough to deal with. But you can use, this is an example of how you can use some of the methods and, techniques and tools that you would use in the vendor side, also on the payroll side. So Dustin earlier mentioned the employee vendor match concept, where you're looking for common attributes, be it name, address, social, phone number, bank account, between your employees and vendors. Well, the great thing is you can just substitute the word vendor for employees, and now you're looking for employee-employee matches. And that's how you can, one way that you can start to look for ghost employees. Do you have multiple employees at the same address? Even if they're not ghost employees, do you have a nepotism policy that's being violated, which can be a risk? In fact, I've seen some frauds around that case where individuals put family members on the payroll. Hours and rate manipulation, those are a couple that are in there as well. And for anybody that's an internal audit on the line, this is a great place to test controls. The example that I've got built into the slides here on payroll, payroll is one where it's kind of tough to build in too many examples, since inherently you're going to have individual employees' information, so we don't have a ton of that. But we have one here where it's based around holiday pay, and the controls in payroll are typically we have supervisors that will go in and approve things, and they do that on a routine basis. Well, it's interesting if you think about that, because we're relying on people to go in and do something that inherently they probably don't want to do, to go in and review payroll and go through and make sure it's okay and approve it and go on. In this case, you can see that an employee in this organization actually had 48 more hours of overtime, or of holiday pay, I'm sorry, than any other employee in this organization, and this was an organization with about 3,000 employees. And the big difference was in that 2-week period into January 20th of 2012, 6 days of holiday where nobody else in the entire organization found it, which is kind of amazing, because the holiday schedule should be one that's pretty detailed, and it's pretty consistent across the board. And this was a case where they said, well, the supervisors approve all the payroll. So, one of the things I would encourage you to do as it relates to in payroll is looking at things as a bigger picture view, not necessarily within a specific pay period, but overall over over the whole scope of time. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3, because as you think about rate manipulation, hours, ghost employees, a lot of that may not be visible in a single pay period, but when you look at it collectively across a time period, it's much more visible. And again, this is something that you can do in quite a few different tools out there. Arbutus being one, ACL, IDEA, Tableau, Excel. This graph right here, many of you probably recognize is from Microsoft Excel. Now, there are some limitations there that I do want to mention. Somebody actually asked the question about this. What about the risks of a spreadsheet? There are inherent risks using Excel. Data integrity, data quality, it can be easily changed. That said, if that's your only tool and that's the only thing that you have available to you, I would much rather you try to use that than do nothing at all. That example that I gave earlier about the $1.2 million fraud, they weren't using anything at all. If they would have used Microsoft Excel to look for checks on the weekend, that showed up in the first $50,000 of a $1.2 million fraud scheme. That really could have helped catch that earlier rather than later. So there are some inherent risks if if you have the option to use a tool that has better data integrity controls. I think that's the way to go. But at the same time, you shouldn't ignore Excel just because it's Excel. I've heard somebody speak at a big data forum, and they said that Excel is a problem, not a solution. And there are some risks there. I'm not going to downplay that, but at the same time, it's much better than nothing. And I think at the end of the day, you need to be using analytics and accounts payable, payroll, and PCards to help strengthen some controls. And if that means you have to use Excel, then so be it until you can get a more robust tool. But I'd much rather see folks doing that than doing nothing at all. So. Dustin, let's go ahead and jump back in and get your thoughts on payroll and some
Sure.
automated analytics.
Sure. I had a question for you, Jeremy. Is the speed, let's say you want to do some type of fraud investigation in general, if you can get to a place more quickly, for example, get that test, whatever it is, done this week versus several weeks from now, is there an advantage to being more agile or quicker to the starting line?
Yeah, I think it's good to have be able to do that, because inherently, if you're being proactive, obviously it's good. But in a situation where you're going to be reactive, having some things ready to where you can quickly implement them and get them into analysis, I think that's going to help your response time. And the sooner you can catch on to an issue, the better off you're going to be, because the longer these fraud schemes go on, the bigger and badder they're essentially going to get over time.
Okay, thanks. So I'm gonna pick up on what I was working on a little bit ago. I'm going to show you now how you can go from a blank project, or one that has very little data within it, and take that, share that, put the results and/or the files or the scripts into a shared folder somewhere where they can be broadcast out very quickly if they're needed. So the shared folders I had mentioned earlier, I didn't really explain how they behave. There's 3 different types. I'm going to show you one slide about that, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of the actual software. So there's 3 types of shares you can set up. A personal share is basically just the files and scripts and such that I want always available to me. When I open up any Arbutus project, I have this personal folder here I've set up. What I see here, these data files, any scripts, whatever I put in here, it's always going to be there, even on a brand new project. Team share is more of a department kind of thing where we all have access to the same location for sharing and storing things, and we have the ability to use things at the same time. Maybe you want 10 people running the same type of analytics or what have you, or just sharing files very quickly. And interestingly enough, you can do this type of share in both a desktop and a client-server environment. So, and then we've actually gotten a lot of feedback recently of people saying, I can't believe how much can be done just from the desktop. The last one, Enterprise, takes all those characteristics from the team share, takes it a big step further in that now you've got built-in automation. So anything that goes into an Enterprise folder, and I'll show you that in the final demonstration piece, you can automate that in one click. You don't need to modify anything to prepare it for that environment. You just drag and drop it. You can also connect from anywhere. All you need is an internet connection. And you can go in and you can access any data and work with it. And it's just like in your office. There's no lag time. It's actually brilliant. And then, of course, you can do a global, if you're a worldwide organization or you're on a trip, you can collaborate with somebody in real time. You can both be looking at the same data, and the productivity boost is pretty substantial that way. So you don't need a team of 15 advanced quote-unquote users or 2 or 3. What you can do is you leverage the best that everybody brings to the table, and that can come together and form something really, really amazing. So I'm going to show you just an example here. I've got some data that's local here. I've got a little folder. I'm going to move that into one of these continuous folders here. Even just taking this file here and dropping it into, say, AP. So it'll ask, hey, do you want to move the table and the data, or just the table layout? I always go ahead and say put it on the server because it's better to work with from there. Same goes for scripts. Here's a script here. If you're a scripting person and you've done this in ACL or other tools, you probably look at this and say, this is a pretty basic script, and the analytic itself is just here to function. But what I can do with that analytic, once I put it into this Enterprise folder here, continuous monitoring, is I can schedule it just like this, right-click, schedule, and that little clock there indicates that's exactly what's going on. And you're up and running. So this is going to run completely independent of your desktop. The results can go anywhere at any time. I've directed mine just into another folder down here, but you can send them anywhere. And then also, you've got a built-in, this thing here that I've clicked on, this is every time that this application has run. The red ones, so it's like a really quick, easy to look at log of what's taken place. Yellow means I got results. I've just been experimenting here. 78, that's the number of results I've gotten. I can look through these, and if this didn't work, I kill it on purpose because I wanted some red in there. I can go right into a log file here and see exactly what happens. So really easy to work with too. If something doesn't go right, I don't know, maybe you forgot to add in a field, something like that, it's right here for you. But I can take, and in a moment I'll show you in the final demonstration, we'll go from start to finish in a couple of seconds, but if you've got a file here and you want to look at amounts over $1,000 and you want to automate that and run that every night, you're only about 5-6 clicks away from doing that. Another thing you can do that I like a lot in some of these views, this is called a trigger. And a trigger allows me to color or highlight data if it meets a criteria. And in this case, this is a description field, and this is a reimbursements file. And it's publicly available data, by the way. So if you see any actual real vendors there, they are real, but this has been scrubbed and it's available online. I'm going to go and grab a listing of what's called a word list. And this is a pretty simple one. I'm going to drag it over here. But you could actually use these text files to drive your keywords. So if you're doing a keyword, you're looking for words like personal and weekend or vacation, you would just list these here, and you can have as many as you want, and then that will be applied to this right away. So if I put in, for example, the word order into this list right now, and I'm going to save that. I always close it just because that's what I like to do. And go back and just basically refresh this file. I'm going to open another file, come right back. It applies immediately. So that's simple and also very effective. Jeremy, I think here I'm going to turn things back to you in a moment, and we'll wrap everything together at that point as far as once Jeremy has presented his next segment. One other thing I want to mention here is this is your basic rows and columns result. No doubt some of you, probably a lot of you, are saying, okay, that's great, but I don't want to show this to an executive team or whatever. What are my options? You can make this data available in several very convenient ways. One of them is you can just use these shared folders, but you can also export this data directly to a database, like a SQL database, and that can be connected live to Tableau, for example. So this, I'll pull up an example of that. This is an online version of a Tableau report I did straight from an Arbutus result. Things like this. And so this would be live. If the script runs again in 10 minutes or whenever it runs, all of this would reflect that. And there's also some back and forth too. If you actually, some of our clients with their monitoring, they want to be able to look at something like this and say, why is Atlanta have this high density here? They can send information back and work with it that way. This kind of thing, how does this happen? The data is made available in the right format for Tableau, and they've actually talked to us a few times about helping them with some of their prospects that are not able to buy what they want because the data is too tricky for them to figure out, and we have been considered as an intermediary. This becomes very easy. I'm an average Tableau user because the data was in a couple of files in a database, a SQL database that I could work with really without much effort. I can do this in a couple of minutes or an hour at most. Okay, Jeremy, I'm going to turn it back to you, and we're going to talk a little bit about PCard, which I agree with you is the low-hanging fruit and a great place to start. And then I'll have some analytics that are built, ready to go, and we'll automate those and see how that works.
All right, that sounds great. Yeah, you know, procurement cards, while corruption is probably the most common fraud scheme, so accounts payable is a great place to go there. Procurement cards, if you're looking for the quick wins and demonstrating value, you know, I think procurement cards are probably one of the best places to go. Some of the common issues that we run into in procurement cards, really there's three, and they're kind of big buckets. The personal use, violations of policy, and then I've got gift cards categorized here separately because they're not only personal use, but you've then also got payroll implications there and payroll tax implications. But the great thing about procurement cards is the data is very high quality. You don't have to worry about somebody inputting the data because it's coming directly from the bank. A lot of times you can even get the level 3 detail from certain merchants, which will show you the line items of what's been purchased. And what there is there. Now, if we go to this first example that I've got, this is an example of split purchases, you know, split transactions. You know, one of the things that we want to look for is if you've got multiple, if you have a transaction limit, and say it's $1,000, you know, that's great and all until somebody goes to a retailer and they swipe their card twice. And from a retail environment, that is two unique transactions. We all know that you can pay with a gift card and then a credit card. Well, that inherently means that you can also pay with two credit cards. So, you know, in this case, we had somebody that swiped their card once for $1,000, and then that was their transaction limit. They had to swipe it again for $400, and that completely gets around the controls. So that's something that, you know, we want to consider. You know, another thing that we want to look at, if we look at just visual analytics, you know, looking for outliers. Dustin just mentioned integrating with Tableau. Simply putting the details out in Tableau, you can very quickly see where some outliers are, you know, the items that show up at the top rather than where most of the purchases are clustered. You can also do statistical analysis within most data analytics programs, and I think that's very good. Just keep it basics, doing the basics with statistics and saying, okay, here are all the transactions, here's the average, here's the standard deviation by merchant, let's look for the outliers and go from there. Another thing that's very useful, I mentioned the gift cards, and if we go to this next example, we'll see that, you know, looking for round hundreds or round tens, it's going to be pretty rare that you would see, you know, round hundreds or round $10 transactions at a retailer like a Walmart or maybe even a restaurant, because inherently, even if you're sales tax exempt, that's not how they price things. So that's a really good indication. Looking for $5, $10, $100 increments at these major retailers, anywhere that you walk in and they have that kind of that pegboard of gift cards is really where you want to focus, because that's going to indicate maybe an indication of potential gift card transactions, which is then again personal use and payrolls. And I just had a question come in here real quickly about the duplicate or the split purchases on PCards that I just mentioned. A little bit more detail around that. What we're talking about there is looking for indications where the same person used their same card at the same retailer on the same day, and then the total of those transactions, which are either under or at the transaction limit, then exceed that. So in that example, what we did is we saw that we had one employee went to Walmart twice on the same day, and their total transaction limit exceeded their total transactions for the day exceeded their single transaction limit. To us, that is an indication that somebody's trying to circumvent that control, because otherwise they should have called in and actually got approval to go over that limit. So that would be how you would create an analytic specifically for that. Essentially, you're summarizing on cardholder, day, and merchant, looking for counts greater than 2 and transaction totals greater than the limit. If we go on to our next example here, something else that we want to look for, and one of my favorite tests is looking for indications that somebody is using their purchasing card either on a holiday or even a vacation day. This is one where we actually saw somebody using their corporate credit card at the suite at the Cowboys Stadium on the Thanksgiving Day game. Not only were they on holiday, but it was also a week they were on vacation. So bumping up the transaction dates against holiday dates or vacation dates for your employees is a great way to identify potential personal use of a purchasing card, and you can get that very quickly. And then finally, just looking for merchants that are unusual. Seeing iTunes, and again, this is public data as Dustin had in his example as well. Seeing iTunes, does that make sense? Or Xbox, Kindle Store, Amazon. Amazon's one that more and more is actually a common merchant for a lot of organizations, but you want to get that level 3 detail. What exactly are they buying from Amazon? Does that make sense? Yes or no? And then from there, building that into your analytics. Somebody asked the question, if you operate 24/7, how exactly do you apply analytics when employees may be working on weekends and holidays? And that question, I think it actually works really well here. Unusual merchants, unusual times, all the analytics that you're designing, you need to have an expectation before you do it. So if you're an internal audit, you're already familiar with setting expectations. We're going to test this transaction. We're going to set an expectation. The expectation is only certain employees are working on a weekend, so therefore only certain transactions will occur on a weekend. The expectation is that we're only using certain types of merchants, and certain people may have other types of merchants. So when you design these analytics, whether it's because you're 24/7 or because you have a unique situation, you want to make sure that you have a clear expectation for the result of that analytic when you're designing it, and that way you can truly evaluate and analyze those results as we mentioned. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dustin. And Dustin, I know you've got kind of a much more robust, kind of bringing it all together type of analytic that you're going to talk about. And while you're doing that, I'm hopeful that, you mentioned your sharing folders, enterprise and team share. While you're talking about kind of bringing this all together, if you would, talk a little bit about the security on the team and the enterprise share, and how you can set up different access controls for different employees.
Sure. And sorry, I was pulling up an example there while you were talking, but I hope that wasn't distracting on your end.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
The shared folders, you set these up. The short story is the security is in where these are stored. The share folder. So I'm going to go and look at, this is called manage shared folders, and just gives me a chance to look at the location of these. Some of these, the CTMP, that's actually on a server. But whatever, here's my personal share, for example. Whatever security, Windows security is over that folder, that applies here as well. So I cannot connect to Jeremy's personal folder because I don't have access to it. I can't log into his machine or his network. On the server side, so there's a Windows server piece to Arbutus, and it really is just a silent party in the background, but it does all of the management here of the enterprise shared folders, the scheduling, all that just takes place in the background. You do everything here in the foreground from the interface. So there's a server level security as well. You saw me go in and grab data from a SQL database earlier. Same thing there. I've got to have a password. I've got to have access to that to be able to touch that data. And along the lines of security, one of the kind of nice to haves or add-ons of Arbutus is you don't need to put anything on a C drive on your local machine. Everything can stay in the server environment, because even when I'm viewing a server file on any of these little chain link files, I'm just viewing it. There is not a copy of that data on my local machine. Jeremy, is that kind of give you an idea, or did you have a specific question on top of that one?
No, I think that helps. That helps quite a bit. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd cover. Thank you.
Cool. And along what you were saying earlier with the transactions, with PCard, and here's another publicly available PCard data, this is a pretty big file. There's 230,000 transactions. Look for the weird stuff. For example, just look at the amount here, and I'm just going to run a command that measures the highs and lows of a numeric field, anything. So it's going to run through, and so now I've got this table here, and I'm just going to go to the bottom and look, what's the most pricey item. Somebody bought something for over $600,000 on their card. I can click and look at that, and looks like maybe professional fees of some sort. I mean, you can go and look for those outliers right away, and the great use of that is the weekend and holidays, like Jeremy had done. JDLR just doesn't look right. Look for those kind of things, because it doesn't take much effort. What I've done here is I've just honed in on this. If I'm done looking at that particular record, I'm just go right back to my data here. I'm not creating any extra files I've got to drag around and figure out. And same maybe for the negative. How do you have a $500,000 chargeback? Walk me through. How does that go back on the card? What does the terminal actually let you do that? Things like that. What I'm going to wrap up with here, because I know we're getting close to our time, I am going to take a basic set of analytics. So this would be part of a PCard. We do things like this for customers, and I think Jeremy does as well, is we'll go ahead and build the test for you. You just want the results, or you want to be able to tweak the test, but you'd rather have somebody else go ahead and build it. So this is a series of analytics. We actually have a whole stable of these for any process, really, AP, AR, PCard, and those are things, tools that are ready to be used. This one, what I'm going to do is take this. This is on my desktop, and I've decided I want to automate this. So to do that, I just drag it into a folder that I've created. I'm going to use the AP folder here. That here, the file, this is my source status, or any of these are my source. And then I can go ahead and schedule this. Let's see. Oh yeah, I put it in the wrong folder. Basically, I can go ahead and run and modify the schedule at any time that I want to. Okay. And I need to grab the supporting data for that one. And then that can just run, and I can run it in real time, I can run it any time. And I really like that because I can do this in a couple of minutes. That used to take literally months sometimes with some customers because of the data sources that I couldn't go grab. And then also on the other end of how the heck do I automate this? I've got this desktop tool, and now I want to somehow have this run and present a spreadsheet to somebody. How do we do that? That can all be done right here from this interface. You can also run things from other tools like Excel, for example. I'm just going to, for the sake of time, show a screenshot rather than the actual whole thing. But this is a basic result in Excel. The way that this arrived is the Arbutus data can be treated as a data source. So Excel actually connected to an Arbutus result and then automatically pulled this in and formatted it for me. So there's some self-serve reporting options with this too. If you've got a department that needs some really timely data, maybe they're looking for split purchases and they want to know as soon as possible, this would be a great tool because it gets them the info they need and they can run this whenever they want. And I think here, as we're up against our time, I'm going to wrap this part up. I'm going to throw up a slide with contact information. I gave you the tip of the iceberg for sure with Arbutus. So if you've got questions, you can ask away either by email or by phone. Same goes for Jeremy. There's our contacts, and we're both happy to talk further about what you're looking at here today.
Yep. And Dustin, let's go back just a few slides and get our last polling question in here, especially for those that are doing CPE. So Jim, if you'll go ahead and put that up on the screen for us. So our final polling question is, do you use automated testing in AP, payroll, or PCards? Yes, no, or unsure. I know we've already talked about how many folks are actually using analytics, and that was over half the audience. So now I'm curious to see how many of you are actually using automated testing, and see if how close we get there, whether or not it's a little bit different mix. My guess is a slightly different mix, but we'll see here. And while we're waiting on that, a couple different questions here that have come in. One related to the check theft example that I mentioned earlier. You know, did that person, what kind of access did they have to AP, check stock, printing, etc.? And another question that came in later about where do good internal controls come into play? In that case, that person did have access to checks, signature stamps, just about everything, check stock, printing checks, printed checks, etc. You know, good internal controls as it relates to analytics. You know, I think analytics are really useful in helping to test internal controls, and they complement internal controls nicely. I don't think that you have to have one or the other. I think that truly to be even more effective, it's having both is really what you're looking for there. Jim, let's go ahead and see what our poll are looking like here. All right, it looks like about over half the audience now is not using automated testing, although we have a quarter that is using automated testing. I think that's outstanding. That's actually a little bit higher number than I was necessarily expecting. So very glad to see that. All right, Dustin, if you want to go ahead and jump back into the slides. We'll go ahead and, as Dustin mentioned, our contact information is here. We left you a quote here as our closing thoughts, and that's in the handouts. I mean, really what we're trying to do with analytics is we're trying to get the right information to the right person at the right time so they can make the right decision. As it relates to fraud, it's so you can be as proactive as possible, or if you're in an investigation, so you can have the most effective investigation, you can be as quickly reactive as possible. There's a number of different ways that you can do that, but really, I mean, there's a ton of data out there. Just simply giving people data is not what it is. It's designing effective analytics that are running timely, as Dustin has shown us here, continually perhaps, so that you can get the best information to the right people at the right time. With that, we'll go ahead and take a few questions here. Dustin, interested to get your thoughts on this one. How do you do analytics when your company does everything in paper? Any tips for transitioning the corporate culture there? Are you there, Dustin? All right, it looks like we may have lost Dustin's audio for just a second. Yeah, as it relates to if you're already doing everything on paper, obviously that's going to be more of a cultural challenge that you need to overcome. Slowly starting to capture the data that you think is most valuable to you, devising a method to do that is really probably the best place to get started. I don't know that we can get into a ton of detail on strategically doing that, but start to capture the data that you think is most valuable to you, and that will help you get started. With that, I know we have a few other questions that are out there. If we didn't have a chance to answer your question, we will answer that. We have the questions, and if you provided your contact information, we'll reach out to help follow up on those questions with you. If you want to reach out to us directly, as Dustin mentioned, our contact information is shown on the screen, either email, phone, or we've also are both active on Twitter and social media and LinkedIn, sharing content and resources that we think will be most beneficial to help you get started with analytics. Again, Dustin is with Arbutus, and I am with BKD, and with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jim.
Well, thank you very much. What a great presentation. Thank you both, Dustin and Jeremy. A lot of great information there, and if you want to follow up with any of these questions, if you can't reach Jeremy or Dustin, you can always send them to AuditNet, and we will forward them on to both of the individuals. Reminder that there will be an evaluation questionnaire which will show up after you exit the webinar, and we look forward to providing more value-added webinars like this in the future. And thank you all, and let you get back to your day, and thanks for joining us. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.